And for low wealth districts where there may not be the capacity to do much in the way of bonding, we're talking small districts in low income areas, the state support in the stream would be something they could save up for a large expenditure if finance doesn't have a problem with a reserve fund. You know, we know last year the governor put a, I think it was a 5% cap on reserves, maybe it was less than that. Finance have any concerns about districts saving money in reserve for large projects?
We're reviewing the LEO's proposal right now. So the reserve proposal we recognize is something that people are interested in discussing again this year, but we're taking a look at their proposal at this time.
You know, I'm just, because this is a totally new kind of proposal from the LAO, another, and trying to address the needs of what the governor's put on the table. Is the governor amenable to restructuring how we process the operations of how we deliver any of the new ideas here? Would he be open to reforming that huge chart of departments that the process has to go through, or is this just layered on top of it?
Madam Chair, we're certainly interested in streamlining the program, creating a program that is simple and not as complex, given the fact that we've been criticizing the existing program for its complexity. So we'd be very open to finding ways to streamline whatever new program is designed.
Have you done, well, I mean, because we're just getting away from state debt. I mean, that's what I hear the message here. And do locals have the capacity to fund their own projects? I mean, actually, I think Senator Hancock said it, locals have made a huge contribution to what the state, not only matching, but some of them have exceeded matching. And even low-income districts or low-wealth districts. And so, so I guess the capacity is there, but if you make some adjustments to developer fees, and if you make some adjustments to this, is the state's role in only helping the folks in lowest dire needs, and if you involve the community, then total community, you know, in terms of cities, et cetera, in terms of addressing community needs, I suppose, and maybe there'd eventually be a dedicated tax if everybody agreed on it. I would suppose that the facility needs might be addressed, but these are all kinds of hypotheticals, and so I'd like to kind of wait until we hear from districts and figure out what the formula might look like. So I, you know.
Paul Golizewski with the LAO. You do have a panel on your agenda that's going to discuss local capacity, so we could address that issue during that discussion if you like.
Okay, thank you.
One more question for me. The funding for this annualized revenue stream, would this be out of Prop 98 or non-Prop 98? Has that been discussed?
Well, you'll see in the report we kind of left it open. We're certainly think the state should consider either approach, but we encourage the state to certainly consider the trade-offs of either funding within the guarantee, funding outside the guarantee. Outside the guarantee, certainly there are trade-offs for every dollar you provide. That's less funding available for other state priorities. Inside the guarantee, we've seen significant growth in recent years and one-time funds, as well as ongoing, and that would allow the state to kind of consider facilities in the context of other educational priorities as well.
So the LEO's opinion is that it is defensible to use Prop 98 funds for this. It clearly is an education-related expense. I don't know if those who proposed Prop 98 and fought for it originally viewed it as being used to support facilities as opposed to bonds and other sources. This would obviously take money away from things that are currently funded by Prop 98 if we use this for facilities.
The language governing Prop 98 doesn't mention facilities specifically. It mentions public debt. So that's why debt service on facilities has been funded outside of the guarantee, but the language doesn't mention facilities. That said, over the years, the state has moved different program areas into the guarantee, out of the guarantee. A notable example is childcare has been in the guarantee, out of the guarantee. So I don't think we would view that as any different of some of these past decisions that the state has made. It is an important question how to fund it within the guarantee or outside. At the same time, I think what we're hoping for you to focus on first is if you want to move to this new view of school facilities, which is an annualized expense, viewing it that way. And then I think a second decision is, do you fund it within the guarantee or outside, based on all of your budget priorities for this year and ongoing.
Okay, all right. I'd like to thank this panel if there are no further questions and turn it back over to Senator Liu.
Thank you very much. Our next panel is up. It's Mr. Jeff Vincent from the Center for Cities and Schools at Berkeley. And Mr. Vincent will hopefully offer some perspectives on reform of the current program, funding models from other states, and principles which should guide our discussion around change. So, behind you. Welcome. Panel of one. This is panel one.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning, and thank you so much for having me, Madam Chair, chairs, and members. My name is Jeff Vincent. I'm Deputy Director and Researcher at UC Berkeley's Center for Cities and Schools. I've spent over 10 years studying issues of K-12 facilities, both here in California and across the country, including looking at how every other state funds school facilities, and we have a report from last year on that. And I'm very, very, very puzzled by the question of what is the appropriate state role for school facilities, both on the funding side and on the policy side, and how those things intertwine. My comments today, which will be brief, are mostly drawn from our January study called Guided by Principles, Shaping the State of California's Role in K-12 Public School Facility Funding. And this was really done with you all in mind, because we knew that this issue was coming before the legislature, and the state was in a position to consider whether or not we were going to be funding school facilities again and what that was going to look like. So as we've been observing this debate unfold, we realized that shared policy principles were completely absent from the discussion, and yet sorely needed to guide folks in Sacramento on making these decisions. And so what we did was take a cue from Michael Kirst, professor at Stanford, and of course the chair of the State Board of Education, who back in 2008 laid out policy principles that really shaped what became the local control funding formula. So what I'd like to do today is briefly describe those policy principles, which are based on our data analysis of what's going on across the state in school facility spending by school districts, in addition to what we're seeing as best practice or leading edge in terms of where other states are going on this. And the handouts that are coming around, one of which is a school district spending chart that I will point to in a second. The second of which is a front and back page that is a 2-page summary of the Guided by Principles study, and I'll particularly point to the charts that are on the back in just a second. And then I'll close by telling you what I think in looking at this, what are the kind of the 3 game changer changes, policy changes that California could really consider. And it's nice to see that some of those are being echoed by the speakers before me. What we ask are, what are fair, responsible options to advance the state's interest in promoting quality education for all students, keeping children safe, and wisely using limited public dollars? And I want to make 3 observations at the very onset that frame everything. The first is which the public has to spend money every year on school facilities. This is an ongoing responsibility. And to not spend money, whether it's coming from the state or the local level or a combination of both, is health and safety risks at one end, but then it's also potentially denying some students 21st century learning environments, and of course everything in between. So what is the minimum bare amount that we would have to spend on these facilities every year? According to building industry researchers and the building industry itself, the recommendation is 2 to 4% of replacement value has to be spent on a building like this to keep it in a steady state of repair. 2 to 4% of replacement value. I want to come back to that in a second. But this is in addition to, or really before, I would say, thinking about deeper modernizations that might occur occasionally, as well as, of course, new construction that's needed, particularly when there is enrollment growth. And to this point, our research and the multiple studies that we have done in California on school facilities issues points to the fact that across California, there is a long-standing, chronic, annual underinvestment in existing school facilities. Unfortunately, we don't have this fully quantified. As Mr. Savage pointed out, we don't have an inventory and/or conditions assessments of our schools, but we can make some inferences about it. But what I would like to say to you is that we simply, as Californians, have not committed to the full cost of ownership of these school facilities. And on that note, every state has a different funding model to address this. And this report gives you a basic summary of the funding formula for every other state on school facilities. You do not have it in your packet, I don't believe, but it is on our website in freely. Oh, great. What we find is 39 states provide capital funding to school districts. Only 11 do not. One of those, Oregon, which has historically not. The legislature is in the process right now of figuring out a way for the state to step in and be a funder of school facilities. About 23 states factor local wealth into their school facilities capital funding formulas. And by, as far as I can tell, 9 states, to the LAO's point just a second ago, at least 9 states provide annual facility allocations to school districts. Most states, however, are on a project-by-project basis. Okay, now I want to turn to the principles. There are 5 of them. The first one is equity. The second one is local district effort and accountability. The third is fiscal stability and predictability. The fourth is facilities adequacy, and I'm going to talk about that one in a little more detail than the others. And number 5, been repeated already, program simplicity. Principle 1, equity. The state's role should ensure equity in K-12 public school facility conditions, and any state funding allocations should be equitably distributed, guided by student, staff, and school needs. The system should enable all students to meet state standards for academic achievement, number 1. But some schools, we need to know, as it's been mentioned here, that some schools will need major capital and/or maintenance resources more than others to provide safe, healthy, and adequate school facilities because their so-called facility burdens are different, whether it's climate, whether it's the age they were built, whether it's the amount of renovation dollars or maintenance dollars that have gone into the overtime, and additional factors. All of those play into what the quote-unquote need is. But why might this be necessary to promote equity in school facilities? It's already been brought up, but I want to show you some data on it. If you turn to the back side of the 2-page handout, you'll see 3 charts. The first one is on assessed value. The local ability to raise local school facility funds appears to be pretty uneven in California. Assessed value. Our analysis of school district assessed value finds that the average AV, assessed value, of school districts serving the poorest students is only 42% of the average AV of the districts serving the highest wealth students. So in those 3 charts, you'll see we have divided all school districts in California by the percentage of students they serve that qualify for free and reduced lunch into 5 categories or quintiles. We also find, and that one actually may be the second one on the back if I'm, yes, that's the second one. We also find on the maintenance spending, if you look at that top chart, the 2 colored bars, red is capital outlay spending by school districts from 2000, and all of these are from 2007 to 2011 dollars. And I can talk to you about where we got the data. Red is capital outlay by school districts, and blue is facility maintenance and operations. And I think something interesting to note here is the 2 categories of school districts serving the more lower income children are spending $100 to $200 more on facility maintenance. A lot of those dollars probably come out of the operating budget, but some of them probably come out of the capital budget as well. But what that may mean is that $100 to $200 per student less is being spent on other elements of teaching and learning and going into facilities. And it speaks back to these different facility burdens, if you will, the different categories of districts have.
Do you have a sense of why so much more per student in those lower income districts?
Well, my guess is that, I'm guessing, this is something I would like to look into. I think that You know, the answer may vary by district, but there could be chronic underinvestment. There could be more substantial, what we might call capital renewals or major modernization, which is on the capital side of the budget, have not been made over time. And so they're playing sort of emergency fire putting out, as someone said earlier, and using more routine maintenance dollars to do that. I would like to look into that more, but I think it's a puzzling and intriguing fact out there. So what we're able to say more about is what districts are spending, but I think it was Chair Liu's comment earlier, how does that relate to what's actually needed? And this is the trickier nut to crack, and I'll get back to the 2 to 4%, but we don't have this inventory. And what we found looking across the country is that 22 states report having statewide inventories, often with conditions assessments that are updated at periodic intervals of the school facilities in their state. And as I have often said in this building, is that if we had even, say, $1 billion to remedy the 100 worst conditioned school facilities in California, the governor said, let's do it, nobody could bring him the list. And how do we feel about that going forward? All right, I spent too much time on that, so let me move forward. Principle 2, local school district effort and accountability. State K-12 facility allocations should incentivize responsible local planning and investment for facilities. All local communities should be expected to make significant and good faith efforts to adequately and responsibly plan for, invest in, and maintain and operate their facilities. And I think this is where we get to issues of planning and, as the LAO called them, accountability plans, but really thinking about how do we build in the capacity for better planning, and really, locals are still prioritizing what they need to do. But what we see, and this is documented in the report, is that we see wide variation in capital outlay by school districts. We see wide variation in M&O spending by school districts. And we also see on the local effort side is that districts are also taking on a lot of long-term debt for this, right? So the chart here shows, on the bottom, this orange one, shows long-term debt, that is debt more than a year out for local school districts by the poverty quintiles of how much debt they're taking on. This is year 2011. If you look at the other handout that I gave you, it shows spending against debt. And what this shows is that local school district debt is on the rise. In 2001, California school districts had, on average, $2,400 in long-term debt per student. 10 years later, by 2011, they had an average of $8,700 per student. The national average in debt per student for school districts is about $6,500. So California is about 30% higher than the national average. I don't know if that's a bad thing, or a responsible thing, or a completely okay thing. That question, I think, is open for discussion. Principle 3, fiscal stability and predictability. A hallmark best practice in this work is stable funding promotes efficiencies. It allows local districts who are doing the activity to plan and be consistent and move forward, and it simply saves money. Principle 4, facilities adequacy. State policies and funding allocation on K-12 facilities should strive to achieve adequate levels of combined state and local investment to promote health, safety, and educational suitability. So let's get back to that 2 to 4%. What is this minimum amount? What we estimate is if you did 2 to 4% of the current replacement value of the stock of school facilities, this puts us at about $7 billion a year. It would be the mid-range of investment needed at about 3% of replacement value. Need to be spent every year on school facilities. Some of that, of course, would be coming from the operating side, more routine maintenance, but most likely some of that would also be coming from the capital side. But I want to be clear, this is not saying this is the state's tab. This would be a combination of local and state funds. And traditionally, if you look over the course of the SFP, as I and others in this room have done, local school districts have been putting in about 70% of facility expenses, while the state has been contributing about 30% over the long haul. So if districts are doing this all on their own, it seems that this will be a really significant burden for many districts. Principle 5, the last one, is program simplicity. And I would say that we've talked about it already, so I don't want to dwell on it. I do think there are room for simplicities, but I think part of that is transparency to the public, to legislators and school districts about how to get into the system, how to navigate it, and who is getting what is, how should I say that? How they're getting what they're getting. But I would caution you that the reason this is so hard, and other states wrestle with it and have revamped their programs over time because of lawsuits or something else, is because it's very complicated, but we can figure it out. There are districts all over the board in terms of size, their climate, as I've said, their needs for facilities. And then, as Member Pan said, you have some districts that have declining enrollment while ones next door have increasing enrollment, and then you have that occurring in the same district. And you can't just move buildings, unfortunately. So we need to be simple, but I would say not too simple. All right, so let me close by saying, what should we do? In my opinion, 3 game changer recommendations, some of which have been echoed here, that advance the principles that I have laid out. One is that state grants or state funding, whatever form it comes for facilities, should be adjusted for local wealth. This so-called ability to pay adjustment. As I mentioned earlier, 23 states are already doing this. So let me just give you an example. Colorado. Local share percentage determined by local capacity and past effort. So a lot of states are doing this with multiple indicators that roll into one calculation. They use 7 criteria, which include AV, local AV, median household income, bond expenditures, and students in the district who qualify for free and reduced lunch. They're taking multiple considerations into effect. Massachusetts, another state that does that with a simple calculation, and those are adjusted annually. 2 is strengthen local control and accountability through improved facility planning. In talking to the people who run state programs across the country, which I have done, this is an enormous interest in theirs, and it is enormous effort that many states have put into. Because why? Because they see it as good planning assures good use, wise decision-making on both state and local funds, but it also saves money. And so we got to that earlier. For example, in Washington, to qualify for state school facilities funds, the program really is built around what they call a study and survey report that districts do. And this looks at a really detailed analysis of conditions, needs, and options going forward. 3, the last thing, focus the state program on asset preservation and enhancement. As a few others have said, we are in an overall growth lull. This gives us the opportunity to make good on the investment in the assets we have already made. We need to orient to today's needs, which is really around our existing schools. We certainly will have new construction needs, but that does not appear, given the data and the trends across the state, to be where the bulk of the needs are. So to conclude, I would say that the state clearly has a longstanding partnership. And the question is, what's a really balanced level of both state and local expense, and in some cases debt, to meet our obligations for this ongoing responsibility? And clearly, local funds have leveraged state funds and vice versa. So thank you very much. We'll be continuing our analysis over the coming months on this, and would be more than happy to provide additional detail on any of our research, both in California as well as what other states are doing.
Thank you. Any questions from members surviving? Okay.
Yeah, just an observation, and it's very positive. It seems that almost all of the folks who've been up here are suggesting proposals that are not inconsistent with one another. They all seem to go in the same direction, which seems to focus more on funding for low-wealth districts, state funding that meets the need rather than just state funding generalized over the entire state. And I think that's a good thing in response to the first question I asked about the inequity we see in the San Diego area in districts from high wealth and low wealth areas.
And the only other comment I have is that I'm a proponent of the community schools concept. And as an opportunity to leverage schools and community resources for students and their families, what recommendations or principles do you have or that we think we should keep in mind in order to take advantage of the opportunity of bringing a larger community together?
Yeah, I think that's an enormous trend, particularly we see it a lot in California. And the state school facilities program has not, to my knowledge, really provided any kind of incentive or other investment to support that. And I think that, as we have done with enhancements to the grants for green or other things, that certainly could be an option, but that also seems to go against the grain of folks saying, let's get more simple, right? Other states have proposed incentives in that regard, but I think too that, this was tried a few years ago anyway, was to increase the ability of the local partners in those community schools to provide capital dollars on the facility side, and we see some examples of that, and there's probably some more experts in the room on that than I, but we could take a look at, on the so-called revenue generating side, these partners, what they may be able to bring to the table. But again, I think that what I see in working with school districts and doing more community use or community schools is that they're trying to do those things in buildings and on campuses that were not designed for that. And this is where design really comes in. And I think to Bill Savage's point about replacements of buildings, a lot of those are in areas that have adopted, say, district-wide community school intentions anyway from a school board. This is where I think the state school facilities program has never provided much, I would say, resource at all on the planning of school facilities. And so I think that when you're redesigning those, in my personal opinion, having looked at this, if the state could provide some even meager financial resources for school districts to do planning, and actually you have this in your bill, I know, around the inventory and conditions assessments, providing some resource like that to do district-wide facility master planning would go an enormous way towards saving on the construction end, in my opinion, and having talked to construction professionals, school facility directors, and others across the state and across the country on this. It's really in the design. If you do more on the design side and on the planning side, you save then on the design side, and that magnifies into savings on the construction side.